Before we begin this incredible story, please hit that subscribe button and press the bell icon so you never miss our amazing true life stories. Now, let's dive into this unbelievable tale. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace. Thomas Miller stood perfectly still in his scarlet tunic and bearskin hat, his expression frozen like a statue. He had been serving as a royal guard for 3 years now, and nothing ever rattled him. Tourists snapped photos, children waved, and some even tried to make him laugh, but Thomas remained motionless. This was his duty, his honor, his life. On this particular Tuesday morning, something felt different. The usual crowd of tourists gathered around, but there was an unusual tension in the air. Thomas noticed a group of people arguing near the palace gates. His trained eyes scanned the situation without moving his head even slightly. 2 men were shouting at each other, their voices growing louder by the second. One of them was wearing a police uniform. Officer Derek Hunt had been having the worst week of his life. His wife had left him. His promotion was denied, and his supervisor had reprimanded him twice in 3 days. Derek was angry at the world, and today that anger was boiling over. The other man, a tourist from Spain, had accidentally bumped into Derek while taking a selfie. It was a simple mistake, but Derek saw it as yet another insult in his terrible week. Thomas watched from his post as the situation escalated. The tourist apologized repeatedly, but Derek was not interested in apologies. His face turned red, and he started pushing the tourists backward. Other officers nearby tried to calm Derek down, but he pushed them away too. The crowd began to back up, sensing that something bad was about to happen. Parents pulled their children closer, and phones came out to record what was unfolding. Then, in a moment that would change everything, Derek turned his rage toward Thomas. Perhaps it was because Thomas was standing there so calmly. Perhaps it was because Derek wanted to assert his authority over someone, anyone. Derek marched toward Thomas with fury in his eyes. He stopped just inches from Thomas's face and began screaming at him. Spit flew from his mouth as he hurled insults at the royal guard. Thomas did not flinch. He did not blink. He stood there, following his training, following his oath. But Derek was not satisfied with just verbal abuse. In a shocking move that made the entire crowd gasp, Derek reached up and shoved Thomas hard in the chest. The royal guard stumbled backward but did not fall. The crowd erupted in shocked whispers and shouts. Several people yelled at Derek to stop, but he was too far gone in his rage. Derek shoved Thomas again, harder this time. The bearskin hat tilted slightly, but Thomas adjusted his stance and remained standing. His jaw was clenched tight, his eyes staring straight ahead. Every muscle in his body wanted to respond, to defend himself, but he knew his duty. Royal guards do not break their composure. They do not fight back. They represent the crown, and they stand above petty conflicts. But Derek was relentless. He grabbed Thomas by the front of his tunic and pulled him close, screaming more insults. Other police officers finally rushed forward and tried to pull Derek away, but he shook them off with surprising strength. The situation was spiraling out of control, and everyone watching knew that something had to give. What happened next would shock everyone present and make headlines around the world. Thomas. Miller's mind raced, even as his body remained perfectly still. He could feel Derek's hot breath on his face, could see the veins bulging in the officer's neck. The crowd around them had grown silent, everyone holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Dozens of phones were recording every second of this confrontation. Thomas knew that whatever happened in the next few moments would be watched by millions of people around the world. Derek finally released his grip on Thomas's tunic and stepped back. For a brief moment, everyone thought it was over. But then Derek did something that crossed every line imaginable. He pulled back his fist and punched Thomas square in the jaw. The sound of the impact echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot. Thomas's head snapped to the side and a trickle of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. The crowd screamed in horror and outrage, yet Thomas did not fall. He did not raise his hands to fight back. Slowly, deliberately, he straightened his head and returned to his original position. His eyes stared forward as if nothing had happened. But inside, Thomas was making a decision that would define his character and change his life forever. He could feel his cheeks swelling, taste the blood in his mouth, but he would not abandon his post. He would not betray his oath, no matter what this man did to him. Derek seemed shocked that Thomas had not responded. It was as if he had expected, even wanted, Thomas to fight back so he could justify his actions. But Thomas gave him nothing. This made Derek even angrier. He raised his fist again, and this time several police officers managed to grab his arms and pull him backward. Derek struggled against them, shouting obscenities and trying to break free. The officers were clearly embarrassed and horrified by their colleagues' behavior. A senior police commander who had been inside the palace came rushing out after being alerted to the situation. Commander Patricia Wells was a woman in her 50s with 30 years of experience on the force. She had seen many things in her career, but nothing like this. When she saw Derek being restrained by 4 officers while Thomas stood bleeding at his post, her face went pale with shock and anger. She ordered Derek to be handcuffed immediately. Derek was still raging, still trying to get to Thomas, but now he was properly restrained. Commander Wells approached Thomas carefully, concern written all over her face. She asked him if he was all right, if he needed medical attention. Thomas, still maintaining his position, responded in a quiet, steady voice that he was fine and would complete his shift. His dedication left Commander Wells speechless. The crowd, which had been shocked into silence, suddenly erupted in applause for Thomas. People were crying, some from anger at what they had witnessed, others from admiration for Thomas's incredible discipline and strength. Tourists from around the world had just witnessed something extraordinary. They had seen a man maintain his composure and dignity in the face of unprovoked violence. They had seen true character under pressure. Commander Wells made a decision right there. She told Thomas that his shift was officially over and that he needed to see a medic immediately. This was not a request, but an order. Thomas finally allowed himself to relax slightly. He saluted the commander, turned with perfect military precision, and marched toward the palace entrance. With each step, the applause from the crowd grew louder. People were shouting words of support and admiration. Some were still filming, capturing this moment of grace under fire. Inside the palace, Thomas was immediately taken to the medical facility. The palace doctor, an elderly gentleman named Dr. Roberts, examined Thomas's injuries with gentle hands. The punch had left a nasty bruise on his jaw, and there was some swelling, but nothing was broken. Dr. Roberts cleaned the cut inside Thomas's mouth and applied ice to reduce the swelling. While he worked, he kept shaking his head in disbelief at what had happened. News of the incident spread like wildfire. Within an hour, videos of the assault were trending on every social media platform. People from every corner of the globe were watching the footage, and the response was overwhelming. Comments flooded in by the thousands, all expressing admiration for Thomas's restraint and condemning Officer Derek Hunt's actions. Major news. Networks picked up the story, and it became the top headline of the day. Thomas sat in a quiet room, still wearing his uniform, trying to process everything that had happened. His commanding officer, Colonel James Harrison, came to see him. The colonel was a stern man who rarely showed emotion, but today his eyes were moist with pride. He sat down beside Thomas and placed a hand on his shoulder, told Thomas that what he had done out there was beyond extraordinary. He had upheld the highest traditions of the Royal Guard, in the face of tremendous provocation. But the colonel also wanted to know how Thomas was really feeling. Not physically, but emotionally. Thomas was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. He admitted that it had been the hardest thing he had ever done. Every instinct in his body had screamed at him to defend himself, to fight back. But he had made a promise when he became a Royal Guard. He had sworn to maintain his composure no matter what happened. His personal feelings had to come second to his duty. The colonel nodded with understanding, told Thomas that he had demonstrated something rare and precious in today's world. True self-control and dedication to principle over personal pride. Then the colonel shared some news. The palace had issued an official statement praising Thomas's conduct and calling for a full investigation into Officer Hunt's behavior. Additionally, the Metropolitan Police had already suspended Derek Hunt. and announced that he would face both criminal and disciplinary charges. Meanwhile, in a holding cell across the city, Derek Hunt was finally beginning to realize the magnitude of what he had done. The rage that had consumed him earlier was gone, replaced by a growing sense of horror. He sat with his head in his hands, replaying the incident in his mind. What had he been thinking? He had assaulted a royal guard in front of hundreds of witnesses and countless cameras. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed. And for what? Because he was having a bad week. Because he was angry at the world. Derek asked to speak with his supervisor. When Commander Wells came to see him, he broke down completely. Tears streamed down his face as he begged for forgiveness. He knew there was no excuse for what he had done. He had disgraced his uniform, his fellow officers, and himself. Commander Wells listened without sympathy. She told him coldly that he would face the full consequences of his actions, and that he had brought shame not just on himself, but on the entire police force. Back at the palace, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. Princess Catherine, who had heard about the incident, wanted to meet him personally. Thomas, still in his uniform, but now cleaned up, stood respectfully as she entered the room. She thanked him for his service and his remarkable composure. She told him that he had represented the crown with honor and dignity, that the entire royal family was grateful for his dedication. Thomas, moved by her words, could only manage a quiet thank you. The following days brought changes that Thomas could never have imagined. His face was on the front page of every major newspaper in Britain and many around the world. Headlines praised him as a hero, a symbol of duty and honor in an age where such qualities seemed increasingly rare. Interview requests poured in from television shows, magazines, and radio stations. The palace communications office was overwhelmed trying to manage all the attention. Thomas's family back in his hometown of Manchester was stunned by all the attention. His mother, Sarah Miller, a retired nurse, gave an emotional interview to a local news station. She spoke about how Thomas had always been a boy of strong principles, how he had dreamed of serving the crown since he was a child. His father, Robert, a former factory worker, watched the video of the assault dozens of times, his heart breaking each time he saw his son being attacked, and his pride swelling each time Thomas maintained his composure. The public response went beyond just words of support. A crowdfunding campaign was started by a group of admirers who wanted to show their appreciation for Thomas's service. Within 48 hours, it had raised over £200,000. Thomas was shocked when he heard about it. He'd only been doing his duty, nothing more. The idea that people wanted to reward him for it seemed strange to him. But the organizers insisted that he deserved recognition for his extraordinary character. The Metropolitan Police, meanwhile, was dealing with a public relations nightmare. Derek Hunt's actions had cast a shadow over the entire force. Police departments across the country faced questions about officer training, stress management, and accountability. The commissioner of the Metropolitan Police held a press conference where he apologized to Thomas, to the royal family, and to the public. He announced sweeping reforms to prevent such incidents in the future, and promised that Officer Hunt would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Derek Hunt remained in custody, awaiting his trial. His lawyer advised him to plead guilty and showed genuine remorse, as it was his only hope for any leniency. Derek agreed. He knew he deserved punishment for what he had done. But beyond the legal consequences, Derek was experiencing something deeper. In the quiet of his cell, he began to reflect on the person he had become. How had he let his anger control him so completely? How had he fallen so far from the ideals that had made him want to become a police officer in the first place? Thomas, on the other hand, tried to return to normal life as much as possible. He went back to his duties at the palace, though he found that tourists now recognized him and wanted photos with him. Some would stand at attention beside him in solidarity, others would salute him, and many simply thanked him for his service. His fellow guards treated him with even greater respect than before, if that was possible. He had set a new standard for what it meant to be a royal guard. One evening, about 2 weeks after the incident, Thomas received an unusual message. Derek Hunt wanted to speak with him. The request came through official channels, with Derek's lawyer explaining that his client wished to apologize in person. Thomas was surprised by the request. He discussed it with Colonel Harrison, who left the decision entirely up to Thomas, It would be difficult, the colonel warned, and Thomas was under no obligation to agree to it. Thomas thought about it for a long time. Part of him wanted nothing to do with Derek Hunt. The man had assaulted him, humiliated him, tried to break his spirit. Why should Thomas give him the satisfaction of an apology? But another part of Thomas, the part that had allowed him to maintain his composure during the assault, told him that forgiveness was also a form of strength. After 2 days of consideration, Thomas agreed to meet with Derek, but on one condition. The meeting would take place at the palace, on Thomas's territory, and it would be brief. The meeting was arranged for a Thursday afternoon in a small conference room within the palace. Security was tight, with 2 guards posted outside the door and Colonel Harrison present as an observer. Derek Hunt arrived in civilian clothes, escorted by his lawyer and 2 police officers. He looked nothing like the angry, violent man who had attacked Thomas. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, his face was pale and drawn, and he walked with his shoulders slumped in defeat. Thomas stood as Derek entered the room. The 2 men looked at each other for a long moment, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Derek's lawyer gestured for his client to speak, but Derek seemed unable to find the words. He opened his mouth several times, but nothing came out. Finally, tears began streaming down his face, and he simply said, "I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry." Thomas remained standing, his expression unreadable. Derek continued, his voice breaking with emotion. He explained that there was no excuse for what he had done. He had been dealing with personal problems and had let them consume him. He had taken out his frustrations on an innocent person who was simply doing his job. Derek said he understood if Thomas hated him, that he hated himself for what he had done. He didn't expect forgiveness. He just needed Thomas to know how deeply sorry he was. The room was silent except for Derek's quiet sobbing. Colonel Harrison watched Thomas carefully, ready to end the meeting if Thomas showed any sign of distress. But Thomas stood calmly, processing everything Derek had said. Then, in a move that surprised everyone in the room, Thomas spoke. His voice was quiet but firm. He told Derek that what he had done was wrong, inexcusable, and had consequences that Derek would have to live with. But Thomas also said that he understood that people could be broken by their circumstances, that everyone had moments when they were not their best selves. Thomas continued, saying that he had made a choice that day to not respond with violence, to not let Derek's actions bring him down to that level. And now he was making another choice. He was choosing not to carry hatred in his heart for Derek. That didn't mean what Derek did was okay. It didn't erase the consequences. But for his own peace of mind, Thomas said he was willing to accept Derek's apology. Forgiveness, Thomas explained, wasn't about Derek. It was about Thomas not letting this incident define him or poison his spirit. Derek looked up at Thomas with an expression of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. He stood and extended his hand, then thought better of it and simply bowed his head in respect. He thanked Thomas repeatedly, saying that this act of grace was more than he deserved. Derek's lawyer, clearly moved by what he had witnessed, had to wipe his own eyes. Even Colonel Harrison, the stern military man, found himself impressed by Thomas's maturity and character. After Derek left, Colonel Harrison asked Thomas if he was truly all right. Thomas admitted it had been difficult to face the man who had attacked him, but he felt lighter now, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Holding on to anger and hatred would have hurt Thomas more than it would have hurt Derek. By forgiving, Thomas had freed himself from being a victim. He had taken back control of his own emotions and his own story. The news of the meeting eventually leaked to the press, while the details were kept private. What was reported was that Thomas had met with Derek and had shown him grace and forgiveness. This only increased the public's admiration for Thomas. People from all walks of life reached out to share how his story had inspired them to show more patience, more understanding, and more forgiveness in their own lives. Religious leaders used his example in sermons. Teachers used it in lessons about character and integrity. Thomas's story had become bigger than just an incident outside the palace. It had become a modern parable about duty, honor, restraint, and the power of forgiveness. In a world that often seemed dominated by anger, revenge, and quick reactions, Thomas had shown an alternative path. He had demonstrated that true strength isn't about physical power or aggressive responses, but about maintaining your principles and your humanity, even when others try to strip them away. Derek Hunt's trial took place 3 months after the incident. He pleaded guilty to all charges, including assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, and breach of the peace. His lawyer presented evidence of the personal difficulties Derek had been experiencing and highlighted the genuine remorse he had shown. The lawyer also mentioned Thomas's act of forgiveness, not as an excuse, but as evidence that Derek's apology had been sincere, that he was capable of rehabilitation. The judge listened to all the evidence carefully. In his sentencing remarks, he made it clear that Derek's actions were serious and had brought disrepute to the police service. However, he also acknowledged Derek's guilty plea, his lack of previous disciplinary issues, and the personal crisis he had been experiencing. The judge sentenced Derek to 6 months in prison, suspended for 2 years, 200 hours of community service, and mandatory anger management and psychological counseling. Derek also received a lifetime ban from serving in any law enforcement capacity. Derek accepted the sentence with gratitude, knowing it could have been far worse. He was determined to use this second chance to become a better person. He enrolled in counseling immediately and began his community service at a youth center, where he spoke honestly to young people about how anger and poor decisions could destroy lives. Over time, Derek found purpose in helping others avoid the mistakes he had made. He would never forget what he had done, but he was committed to living differently. Thomas continued his service as a Royal Guard, but his life had changed in ways both big and small. The crowdfunding money that had been raised was donated, at Thomas's request, to charities supporting veterans and first responders dealing with mental health issues. Thomas felt strongly that Derek's breakdown had highlighted a larger problem of stress and support systems for people in demanding jobs. If his misfortune could help others get the help they needed, then something good would come from it. Thomas was also promoted to the rank of Lance Corporal, a recognition of his exemplary service. He began mentoring younger guards, teaching them not just the practical aspects of their duties, but the mental and emotional discipline required to maintain composure in difficult situations. His story became part of the training curriculum for new Royal Guards, an example of the standard they were all expected to uphold. The incident brought Thomas closer to his family as well. He visited his parents more often, realizing that life was fragile and that the people we love should know how much they mean to us. His mother framed several newspaper articles about him, which embarrassed Thomas, but also made him smile. His father told him often how proud he was, not just of what Thomas had done, but of the man he had become. Years passed, and the intense media attention gradually faded. Thomas eventually retired from the Royal Guard after 15 years of distinguished service. He was awarded the Royal Victorian Medal for his exceptional service to the Crown. At the ceremony, he stood proud in his dress uniform as the medal was pinned to his chest. His family watched with tears of joy, and even some of his former fellow guards attended to honor their friend and colleague in retirement. Thomas became a motivational speaker, traveling to schools, businesses, and organizations to share his story and the lessons he had learned. He spoke about duty, about controlling your reactions when provoked, about forgiveness, and about maintaining your integrity when everything seems to be falling apart around you. Young people especially connected with his message in an age of instant reactions and social media outrage. Derek and Thomas never became friends, but they did exchange letters occasionally. Derek would update Thomas on his progress in therapy and his work helping others. Thomas would offer encouragement and remind Derek that everyone deserves a chance at redemption if they're willing to do the work. Their story became an unlikely example of how even the darkest moments can lead to growth and understanding if people are willing to choose a better path. The video of the assault remained on the internet, viewed millions of times over the years. But it was always accompanied by the full story, by the context of what happened afterward. People watched it not to see violence, but to see an example of remarkable self-control. They watched it to remember that we all have choices in how we respond to the worst moments of our lives. Thomas had chosen duty over impulse, forgiveness over hatred, and grace over vengeance. In doing so, he had become an unlikely hero for a generation, searching for examples of true character and strength.